Hello and welcome to this webinar looking at the future of student accommodation. The event is being hosted by SEC Newgate this afternoon. SEC Newgate is a global strategic communications and advocacy group with over 600 employees around the world, working at the nexus of business, politics, communities, markets, and the media to deliver positive outcomes for our clients. We are absolutely delighted this afternoon to welcome 4 experts in the field of student accommodation, and we really are in for a fascinating discussion. We're recording the event, so if there's anything you missed and you want to watch it back afterwards, the video will be made available when we finish on our website. And so it only remains for me now to introduce our chair from the afternoon from Bloomberg, Olivia Konotey-Ahulu. Olivia, over to you.
So hi everyone, thanks for being with us on a busy lunchtime on a Thursday. So I cover residential real estate for Bloomberg News, and we have a lot to cover in a 45-minute window. We've got 3 really interesting speakers here who are going to give you 3 quite different perspectives on the student accommodation sector. So maybe just as a starting point, I'll let my guests introduce themselves. So maybe if we start with Alex, if you want to tell us a bit about yourself quickly.
Afternoon all. My name is Alex Pease. I'm CIO of Watkin Jones Group. We are a specialist developer focusing on residential for rent in the UK. I guess our core markets cover student accommodation, in which I think we're probably the largest deliverer of student accommodation in the UK, but also sort of very firmly moving into sort of build to rent, co-living, and other sort of residential for rent activities.
Cool, thank you. And then maybe Anthony, if you want to tell us a bit about yourself.
Good afternoon all. My name is Anthony Hart. I'm a partner at Allsop, and we're a property consultancy. I specialise in student housing and head up the student housing team at Allsop.
Great, cool. And then Richard?
Yep, hi everybody. So I'm Richard Ward. I'm head of research at StuRents. So StuRents is the UK's largest student accommodation ecosystem. So we have 3 distinct arms to the business, really. We have StuRents.com, which is the UK's largest marketing platform for students. So we advertise over 750,000 beds across the UK. We also have a property management software that's been built by our own in-house developers, being utilised by both HMOs as well as PBC operators. And then we have research and data. So we're uniquely positioned really to leverage our expertise from our marketing platform, as well as our PMS, to provide highly granular data to a wide range of industry stakeholders.
Great, thank you. So as I said, 3 quite different perspectives. So I think it's going to be quite an engaging discussion. And then, so if we just get straight into it, I think kind of with any discussion in any sector at the moment, you kind of have to start talking about the pandemic. So maybe if we just start addressing the elephant in the room, and then we can kind of move past that. So maybe if we just start with, how has the PBSA sector been affected by COVID, and kind of how long-term are those impacts? So again, maybe Alex, if you could start us off about what you've seen.
Sure. I mean, I guess, from our position, we are a developer. We work with the institutional funding markets, and we're also an operator through our operational arm Fresh. So I guess, when COVID hit, the impacts for us were across all of our construction sites, all of our existing buildings which we operate, and also the investment market as a whole. And I guess we just tried to be a very sort of professional and sort of conscious sort of developer. We wanted to look after our staff as much as anything, and what that obviously entailed is we closed down all of our construction sites, because it wasn't safe to have them open, and we ensured that all of our buildings were sort of COVID secure along with the guidelines. And I think that had its pressures on us as a business. Clearly, we've got tight build programs. You have to deliver student accommodation for a certain date, and so I guess where we then went was, how can we innovate? How can we remobilize the sites when it's sort of the health and safety directives allow us to? How can we work in different ways to ensure that maybe with 80% input we can still get 100% output? So I guess that was one of the real challenges we had from a development construction point of view, and the tail of that's probably been felt, through obviously the core of COVID, but still being felt a little bit now. I guess clearly from a Fresh perspective, COVID has just really brought to the fore, the benefits of PBSA and having that sort of pastoral care and that service offering, which students have really appreciated. It's been an incredibly tough time for students, incredibly tough time for operators, trying to find the right balance between sort of making sure that, the customers are looked after in the building. So again, I guess, impacts from COVID, we are not in a clear letting market this year. There are still sort of the tailwinds of COVID impacting things. Hopefully things are getting much more back to normal and sort of finding its feet again. Certainly our lettings are substantially up, and there's real good optimism that people want to study in universities. People don't want to do online courses, and they want to come back and take up places in halls of residence. So I think that's really positive. I guess the final one from me to touch on in COVID impacts is I'd have to touch on the investment market. And I think, having been through the biggest upheaval and disruption that the operational side of student accommodation has ever had, what's been incredibly encouraging has been just how stable the investment market has been, how stable the pricing's been. And what we're seeing still is investors wanting to deploy capital into PBSA in the UK. We've got existing investors wanting to deploy more and new parties wanting to come in. And we can look at our own experiences. We recently did a deal with DFI, German sort of institutional capital, a new entrant to the student market. And I think what's happening is people are looking through sort of the COVID operational disruption and viewing it as relatively short term. And instead they're looking at the real plus points, the demographic curve, increasing 18-year-olds in the UK for the next sort of 7-8 years, much better rhetoric coming from the government about international students. And all of that's building this confidence that student numbers are growing. And therefore that will fuel sort of a next wave of sort of PBSA and keep it as a really enduring asset class.
Okay, thank you for going through that with us. And maybe you just turn to Anthony now. Would you agree with that? Would you say that the disruption that we've seen is relatively short term? And how has the pandemic affected your decision making when it comes to investment?
Well, I suppose in my lifetime I'd never experienced anything like it. So we had a number of deals as a property consultancy in play, so to speak, when the sort of pandemic hit. And I don't know, it's strange actually, because it felt as though everybody had a common understanding that these deals weren't going to proceed. No one sort of fell out about it, for want of a better phrase. And everyone seemed to switch their focus operationally to more pertinent, more important issues of, I just need to look after my current investors, investments, and my students. And it was an odd one really, because normally when deals stall, there's some form of falling out between parties over one point or other. But in this instance, it didn't feel like that at all, and it felt as though everyone had an understanding that actually, there's a bigger and wider issue at play here, and that everyone needs to go away and address it in their own ways. And therefore, from an investment perspective, from an agency perspective, and doing deals, it essentially everything stalled, and nothing really happened for sort of 6 months or more, really. And so echo what Alex was saying there. That's not because there was any immediate feeling that student accommodation wasn't anymore the right place to be investing money. It was just simply because everyone had to switch focus at that point onto other matters. And the confidence in the sector has been unwavering. I mean, as Alex said there, you've still got walls of money wanting to come in because all of the demographics pointed in the right direction. And, as we move forward now, yes, we're still presented with some challenges on the ground doing deals, occupancy and whether or not international students and how many international students will arrive is a bit of an unknown still as we speak right now, although it's becoming clearer by the day. And that uncertainty doesn't really help matters when you're trading operational buildings. It's not so important if you're funding deals, as Alex does in his space, because obviously, you're probably looking at 2-3 years down the line when when your building's PC. But so we've got some occupancy uncertainty, to be truthful, and we're working through solutions, and we're using mechanisms to get deals over the line, such as rental top-ups, guarantees, escrows, etc., holding money, and looking at performance of the asset over the year. And two, we're also seeing quite a lot of short-term contracts issued in order to fill beds, and that creates as a bit of an issue for operational stock too, because it's more difficult to predict the full revenue stream for the year. But I would again agree with Alex. Having said all of that, investors want to do deals. There's new money. Yields have stabilised. They've remained strong, and there's lots of evidence of that. So I'd say it was a bit of a moment in time, car crash almost, when COVID hit, but quickly investor sentiment picked up, and people want to find ways of dealing with any short-term issues to get deals over the line.
Thank you. And actually, Richard, could you talk to us a bit about what the numbers are saying about how quickly we are recovering from kind of the car crash, as Anthony put it? And it would be quite interesting to hear also about about the difference between how PBSA is coming back compared to HMOs, and then also about domestic students versus internationals. It would be great if you could tell us what you're seeing there.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to go back to kind of the start of the pandemic, really, and obviously as a marketing platform, we have insights into both HMOs as well as PBSA. I think what was really interesting, if we look at those as two individual sub-markets, essentially, is the HMO market performed very, very well. And actually we saw very little impact to the HMO sector. A good reason for that is obviously seasonality is one part of the picture. So the HMO market typically moves much earlier than the PBSA sector. That's also actually been the case this year for this 2021 cycle as well. And we've seen really strong demand from students to live in HMOs, and that's been up year on year. Obviously, if we go back to 2020, so kind of March, April time, when obviously COVID hit, obviously there was a lot of uncertainty around what the impact would be to international numbers. And I think what we found is that PBSA operators started to realise and appreciate the differences in seasonality. So operators that maybe in April, May had concerns over whether internationals were coming or not, maybe took a decision to try and attract more domestic students. The problem with that strategy is in some markets, the domestic sector had been and gone because that HMO market moves very early. So actually having an understanding of the differences between HMOs and PBSA in terms of seasonality can be very important when it comes to trying to put together a marketing strategy. In terms of a bit more colour on international demand, so I think Alex already touched on this season for PBSA in particular has been slow. I think that's fair to say. I think it's been somewhat of a nail-biting wait to try and get to decent levels of occupancy. And again, that's very different to the HMO market. I mean, we speak to HMO operators that were perhaps fully let by Christmas because the domestic demand is still there. And I think most domestic students, they want to move out of their home with their mum and dad, and are obviously keen to get back into a house share with their friends, essentially. So as I said, demand this year for HMOs has been very strong. And actually what is interesting, what we saw again last year is when you look at the numbers, so stats, for example, released by UCAS, which were very positive and got a lot of attention last year. And again, they've been positive this year in terms of international numbers. Going back to the start of the pandemic, what we soon quickly found out is that whilst those numbers are very positive for the long-term health of the PBSA sector, and particularly when you're talking about international numbers, the reality is that did not translate to heads on beds, essentially. And what is interesting is when you start to look at things like the number of Tier 4 visas issued to international or to Chinese students in particular, last year for the year ending September, they were down more than half. And really that shows a much more accurate picture of what was happening in terms of students wanted to come, but they physically could not come to the UK or had reservations to do that. Positively though, looking at those same numbers for this year, which go up to June currently, but they're up, over 170%. So that actually shows that Chinese students in particular are intending to travel by the looks of it. And obviously, that's positive. Those numbers are obviously somewhat skewed because last year was a particularly low base. But I think it's all positive and it's all moving in the right direction, albeit. Yeah, I imagine there are some operators that have, been kind of nervously waiting for those numbers to increase. But we've definitely seen that over the last couple of months.
That's really interesting. So we have this kind of issue where there's potentially a significant amount of uncertainty still about occupancy. I think it's fair to say, even though it is, as you say, moving in the right direction. And so I was just wondering what you will think about what you're seeing as kind of the biggest challenges at the moment, because there's some things which, not many people have any control over, such as travel restrictions. But then I was just wondering, there's a lot of other things going on at the moment. As we're seeing, for example, kind of materials inflation, labour shortages. There's no end of things potentially to be grappling with. So I was just wondering what's kind of the things that you are thinking about most and potentially dealing with the most. So maybe again, Anthony, if you talk to us about what you're dealing with.
So I think for me, in terms of getting I suppose my job on a day-to-day basis is agreeing deals and getting deals done. And I think the biggest challenge for us at the moment is a COVID hangover, as we've touched on, some uncertainty still around occupancy. And that's really just because we just don't know whether the international students can get here, even though, as Richard said, things are looking good. We don't know exactly where we're going to end up. And if there's a shortfall, that's going to have a knock-on effect. So it's not to say that this is the case for the whole market. Of course, students now a very mature market. So, in some instances, buildings are full in some cities, and, you're struggling to get beds. But in others, there is still availability of beds, and really we're looking at that international cohort to take up that slack. And if that doesn't happen in the deals that we're doing at the moment, then there's conversations to be had about how you deal with that, because quite a lot of the pricing is based off of expectancy to receive a full rental receipt for the year. So if you're not getting that, then what impact does that have on the price, and how do you deal with it? So that's sort of one thing that we're dealing with on the ground at the moment. And the other is to move on slightly from COVID. For us, has been still the fallout from Grenfell, and in particular external wall systems and building materials and fire safety generally. To be honest, compliance, and again, the feeling is that there's a common perception in the market that these problems need dealing with collectively, as opposed to becoming a war of we're not paying for this, we're not paying for. Everyone seems to want to get these things resolved. Everyone understands the importance of making these buildings safe for students, but that's not to say that it doesn't pose challenges for us in getting deals done, because there's still a level of uncertainty around what isn't a flammable material. And to what extent. There's still lots of uncertainty and misunderstandings around things like EWS1s and when they're required and when they're not required. And lenders too, when they're involved, they're also looking at these fire safety points and taking a belt and brace approach in most instances, and perhaps requesting information that's not relevant. So that's creating challenges. That's not to say that deals aren't getting done and can't be done, because they can. It's just that it's taking longer and to get to a position of understanding for all sides. So I'd say that those two, for me, are perhaps the biggest issues at the moment in PBSA space.
And how about you, Alex? Is that are those two things also something which you're trying to deal with? We have a new Secretary of State for Housing who's going to be dealing with fire safety, and there's no end of things potentially that kind of in his remit. How much is the fallout of Grenfell affecting your day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I guess every developer, you got to look at all the positive things that have come out of Grenfell, which is, and I think what you have is a real alignment between developers, investors, everyone just wants to get it right. There's an absolute willingness there, and I think that's what we've really seen sort of come through. And is trying to fix building regs which weren't where they should be, and everyone's working towards it. So, ultimately, do we see it as a major issue in our day-to-day business? No, I don't think we do, because we're adapting, just as developers and contractors have to adapt every day to what the new environment is, and it's just so clearly right that we do that. Then we don't consider it a particular issue. It's just something that we deal with, and I think all of our experiences dealing with investors, where there have been impacts, have been really pragmatic, really sensible. Sort of let's just look after the students and the building first, and we'll sort it out between ourselves. And so I think that's been a positive. I think that engagement between all the sort of health and safety, fire reg people, the developers, the investors, that's been a real positive. I think clearly one of the knock-on impacts of that is costs and inflation. So I mean, if you ask me, the issues that we're dealing with day to day, liquidity is good. We think that's positive. Operationally, there's still tailwinds, as I said, but overall great dynamics. Really optimistic about that. I think you then look at what else impacts us. Land. Well, land prices are always high. It's always the curse in the UK, but we are still able to obtain land. So then you come down to, I guess, the two impacts are those inflationary costs, and part of those are born out of the health and safety aspects, which are absolutely right, and that is a given, and everyone's on a level playing field. So that's not particularly the issue. It's clearly well publicised inflationary impacts, through Brexit, through COVID, whatever combination you want to dream up, it's kind of impacting it. And that's something we're monitoring very carefully. As a business, I think as a business, we feel we're able to control it perhaps better than others, because we specialise in residential for rent. We've got very secure subcontractor sort of supply chains. We've got good buying power. So, and we also look to forward buy as much as we can. So, there are mechanics that you can utilise to try and combat that inflation, but 100% you need to be looking at it very, very carefully. And if it continues, then ultimately you'd think that has to feed through to the land price, to keep things stacking. And I guess the other element from a developer is planning, and planning still remains, a pretty tough environment for PBSA in the UK, and it shouldn't do. We do see PBSA as a force for good. It releases other housing stock. It creates, there is a housing need for it, but inevitably you do have some local authorities who are very reticent, that they would rather see other developments. I guess the NIMBYs factors come in, and people don't want students in their area, and that's that constant battle that we as a developer are having to face. And so that does stifle some of the supply coming online that we think is needed. But those, I guess, the things that we really focus on. But overall, we're still pretty optimistic for the sector as a whole in the UK.
Okay, well, I feel like there's a lot more that we could kind of discuss in that area, but I'm aware of time. So we've talked about the challenge bit, and then so if we kind of go on to the opportunities. So I was wondering, Richard, actually, if you could talk to us a bit about some of the dynamics behind supply and demand. So, for example, where we're seeing the highest levels of PBSA uptake and maybe also the lowest areas, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I guess to kind of start with a positive angle. So obviously, I think it's been well covered. Locations like Bristol, sending students to Bath, and York University as well, sending students to Hull. So there are certainly some locations that demand growth has been pretty spectacular for some universities, and that is primarily focused towards the higher tariff universities and the Russell Group universities. But it's not just those, it's worth noting. There are some what you may classify as lower tier universities that are recording strong growth as well. But I guess to touch on kind of an element that Alex mentioned in terms of affordability and rising costs, that is a major challenge we would see for some PBSA operators, particularly in markets that have received a lot of supply. Sheffield is a prime example of this, where over the since 2017, really, you've seen more than 10,000 PBSA beds added to that city, yet demand growth over the same period is probably sub 4,000. So you have this pretty large disconnect between supply growth and demand growth. So then really the challenge for operators in those markets is either trying to capture market share or trying to attract domestic students out of HMOs. Now, in some cities, that's easier than others. A location like Cardiff is a good example of this, where the average HMO is around £85 person per week. So for higher price to PBSA, the challenge is how do you bridge that gap? If international growth is not strong enough, how do you attract domestic students across? And I think some operators need to try and maybe look at it slightly differently. So one example of that could be, for example, domestic students typically house hunting groups, for example. So it could be, one mate that's looking for accommodation for him and 4 other friends. They would look to book an entire cluster within a PBSA block, essentially. So can operators then pass on some of the cost of acquisition that they would otherwise face if they had to fill each one of those individual rooms? And can that be passed on to a group of domestic students in the form of lower rents, essentially? And obviously that may help to bridge that gap between the cost of HMO and PBSA accommodation. So there's things like that I think the market can possibly look into that may help them in terms of trying to bridge that gap. But I think the HMO market, it is very positive. We've already touched on kind of the positive aspects around increasing 18-year-olds. So I don't see that turning negative anytime soon. And PBSA and HMO, it tends to kind of be put in the context of one competing with the other, but the reality is they coexist. That's not going to change. I mean, HMOs are still 70% of all private accommodation for students in the UK. So yeah, I think there is plenty of room for those to coexist, but as we've touched on, investors do need to be wary in terms of locations where the dynamics may be not currently positive. Having said that, I think what is interesting in terms of opportunities for operators and investors is even in markets like Newcastle, for example, which was a pretty early moving market in terms of PBSA investment. What we saw there is obviously an influx of PBSA accommodation. New builds in Newcastle are relatively few and far between and has a relatively small pipeline. So actually there's opportunities there where locations where demand growth is still strong and the universities are still reputable, can investors look 2-3 years down the line when actually the supply and demand dynamics in a location such as Newcastle are going to be very different to what they are today. And actually it's trying to foresee that and get ahead of the curve, essentially, which I think could present some interesting opportunities as well.
Yeah, and Anthony and Alex, I'd be interested in what you think about that relationship between PBSA and HMOs, and if they're competing, or if actually there's enough space for both, and how as operators you can kind of differentiate yourselves.
I don't mind going first, Alex. I feel it can clearly coexist. The way I see the supply-demand dynamic is that it's very difficult to make a comment on the market generally because there's just too many nuances across the sector. But if I am to make a comment across the whole market, and you do look at the expected growth of students over the next 2035, it's expected to be somewhere between 250 and 350,000 students more than we have today, both in terms of UK and 18-year-olds and international growth. And if that's the case, then we clearly need to be building more PBSA, because the way I feel the HMO sector is at the moment is it's probably not going to get any bigger than it is now, in so much as there's so many planning restraints now around HMO. Article 4 is the big one that people now, where there's Article 4 in play, and investors, developers have to apply for planning consent to turn a normal house into a HMO, and they're likely not going to get it because the councils have put those restrictions in place for our reason, which is to restrict the growth of further HMOs. So they're almost like a bit of a finite resource now at HMO, and that's being seen in their values, which are on the up. Yields are are hardening for HMO accommodation. I always feel that there will be a place for HMO in the student sector, always, as much as councils would like, in some instances, to get students into PBSA buildings. We always say also it's like a rite of passage, going to university and living in a house with your friends. So we think that will always remain as it is now. The growth in the PBSA sector, though, it needs to be somewhere between, 17,000-25,000 beds a year across the UK to cope with that level of demand, 350,000 extra students between now and 2035. I don't think we can get any more students into HMOs, or certainly not many. So therefore, that slack has to be taken up by the PBSA sector. My conclusion is therefore that they can coexist.
Okay, what do you think, Alex? Is that the case that kind of HMOs, when it comes to the new students coming in, that the surplus can go into PBSA?
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately, it's all about choice. You have a range of products and you have a range of price points, and that's the same in PBSA. You might have first generation kit in great locations, which is I guess less advanced but cheaper, all the way through to the very, very high end. HMO just offers another way of living, another option for living. Sometimes it's more affordable, quite often it is. Sometimes it's not. It does depend, and of course they can coexist. I think you are right to look at the general trends, and generally it's trending towards more people moving into PBSA, and I think that's driven by sort of push and pull factors, as was alluded to just then. Article 4s have had a big impact in certain areas, but also there are pull factors from PBSA. I think, interestingly, back in 2012, which feels a long time ago now, but they brought in tuition fees, and everyone's proclaimed that was the death knell for PBSA, because students had to pay £9,000 for their degree, therefore they couldn't possibly want to pay more for their accommodation. What actually transpired was very, very different, and actually a whole swathe of students came back into the PBSA market because they were paying for their degree. They really wanted to focus on it. They really wanted to get the grades, and that they wanted to work hard. And they found that the environment provided by the PBSA schemes, which suddenly started providing study areas and very high speed internet, etc., just suited what they needed better. So I think there are trends. I think again, picking up on the point, there's a real cyclical nature to this supply-demand debate, and Newcastle is a fantastic example of a market which had a lot of stock, and then it got a bit of indigestion. Quite a few beds came on at a point in time, and everyone said, "Well, Newcastle's market's dead now." But of course, what happens? You got a huge obsolescence with student accommodation. There's still a great proportion of it was built pre-99 and doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have the internet infrastructure. And these fall out of the supply chain, and student numbers grow, and suddenly you really look at those supply-demand dynamics, and actually, yes, the city is viable again. So, I'm probably just echoing what everyone's sort of said. They coexist, that they offer students choice, which is the key thing, and each market's got its own sort of rhythm and cycle.
And just one other thing, which I quickly wanted to touch on, is which we haven't discussed, is kind of the net zero agenda, and we've got COP26 coming up very soon. And I was just wondering again how much that's factoring into your discussions, and the potential cost of that, and how you as in your individual capacities are kind of dealing with that.
I mean, happy to go first, just from our point of view. ESG agenda is incredibly important to us. I had a 7-hour ESG meeting yesterday with our exec board, discussing exactly these questions, and it's important for, I guess, a number of key reasons, and primarily because it's important to all of our key stakeholders. Our shareholders are very, very keen for us to be a responsible business. Our institutional investors are absolutely demanding that everyone address, and their supply chain address, the ESG agenda. I think almost more importantly than anything, our customers, our tenants, are becoming a lot more conscious of their sort of building's footprint and where they're living and their sort of social responsibility, and also our staff. So our key stakeholders across the board find it important, and therefore, of course we've got to find it important. And what's difficult is, there's a lot of accusations of sort of greenwashing, ESG agendas, and some bits are really easy. Some of the social sides, there's really pragmatic things we can do immediately to really address, and it's the same with the governance. I think the carbon side, we're working incredibly hard to make steps towards a net zero sort of pathway, and I can't say too much. We'll be sort of looking to sort of put a lot more sort of meat on the bones in terms of what our plans are in the coming months. But big steps for us are moving from BREEAM Very Good to BREEAM Excellent in terms of our ratings for our student buildings. That's a decision we've made as a business, that we just think is the right thing to do to create a better building and a better environmental footprint. So hopefully that covers it from our point of view. But there's lots to come on it, and I think everyone's still learning. And you don't want to overpromise. You want to really understand what you're doing and let people know sort of very clearly what you're going to do to contribute to it.
Sure. I'm looking at Anthony just in case you've got anything to add.
I think Alex is probably the best person to comment on that. All I would say are challenges in sort of retrofitting existing buildings, and particularly some of the older stock. But there are, if you can't make them carbon neutral and net zero, then there are things you can do to make them more efficient. Certainly. What I would add to that is that you've clearly got a generation of students now who, as the customer, I think probably think more about this than any generation beforehand, and I think that's going to be really important, perhaps as a sales factor going forward when selling rooms to some students, and perhaps a growing number of students, that they want to know that the environment they're living in isn't impacting on the wider environment. So that's something perhaps that will drive it even further if the customer themselves is very mindful of this. I'm sure Alex probably agrees that's probably a trend that we'll see, and so the importance of delivering to those customers net carbon developments is important, both for us as a world but also as a sales factor for the students too.
Okay, thank you. And just one other thing, because I think we're kind of running quite close to 1:45 when we have to wrap up. But just one other thing I was wondering is, because obviously students are incredibly important sometimes to local economies of the cities and can really change the dynamic of a whole city. But then at the same time, they're transient populations, and there's all the factors that come along with that. So I was just wondering what you all thought about how often do PBSA kind of developments face opposition from people who are, from local people basically, and is it necessary to counter it? Are there strategies that you can put in place to think about it? Alex, if you start off on that particular one.
Yeah, look, it's the enduring feature. You can understand it. There's sometimes a local reticence, regarding PBSA. I guess first and foremost, you're not creating more students by creating the building. What you're doing is you're housing those students and probably taking them out of other areas where they might be harder to manage. These schemes have high levels of pastoral care and that they look after the students, but they also ensure that the students' behaviour is well monitored, and so actually they can be a real positive for local areas. And I think there's a whole education piece. We try and engage with the community to let them know the benefits. I think also, actually, students fuel a huge amount of the economy, but also it goes further. What local authorities want, you've got these great universities in their cities, and then all the students leave and move away and go down to London or wherever. And what you're trying to create is an environment where people want to stay in the city they've studied in. You want them to fuel your employment. So actually, sort of academic centres, universities, and as a consequence, PBSA can really be sort of drive an economy much more than just that students have a high spend. Actually, if you can create an environment where they coexist really well with the local community and are established within it, then they might stay, and you can provide, they might move into build to rent and fuel that sector. but actually more importantly, they fuel the employment zones for a Birmingham, for a Bristol, which encourages those cities to grow economically, which creates wider benefits. So there's loads of things that we need to do, and it's all about engagement and trying to demonstrate, what the building can do, what you can do operationally, and also what the benefits are. But there's no one single silver bullet. It's a whole sort of range of, I guess, processes that we go through.
Richard, what do you think? Is there any research that you've done about that dynamic between local communities and students?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always going to be difficult to overcome that, not in my backyard mentality that some locals may have. I think where we see the demand is more on the developer side in terms of trying to get developments through planning. And obviously we spoke a lot today about broad trends in the market, and that's absolutely relevant still. But I think where we see opportunities for developers and investors is using much more granular data to actually go to planning committees and, again, rather than talk about broad trends within the city, really highlight the need for that specific product type, whether that's price, location, whatever it may be. And that should, in theory, provide these planning committees with more assurance that what is being proposed is actually meeting a specific need, rather than a kind of broad undersupply which may occur in any given city. But yeah, I think the local communities part, obviously Alex has probably got a lot more experience on that. Yeah, I think it's always going to be difficult to overcome that, but it's probably just an educational piece that needs to take place. And even perhaps, going so far as opening up maybe community spaces in PBSA to the wider community, so they're accessible to maybe non-students as well. I think that could be an interesting opportunity. But yeah, I think that's about it.
Great, thank you. And Anthony, how much is this something that you look into?
To be honest, from a deal doing perspective, which is my day-to-day job, not something I can really add too much comment on. All I would say is that, in most instances, councils have been quite careful about where they're putting larger scale PBSA developments and almost clustering them in some instances. And with regards to HMOs, which I think some of these issues probably allude to, is because it's a mature market now. You often find, strangely, is that people that are still living in amongst the students have either quite like it or have gotten used to it, or you do actually find that in some environments you've got peace and harmony between students and residents, in the sense that there's they sort of understand how they live, and they understand how and they respect the way that the residents live. So the local residents live. So for me, I've never really encountered it as an issue in my day-to-day job.
Okay, well, peace and harmony sounds like a nice note to end on, because I think we've come to the time. So just going to hand over back to David now from SEC Newgate to kind of close us off.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank all our panellists this afternoon. Such a fascinating debate. You obviously packed a lot into 45 minutes. I think you could probably have gone on all afternoon, to be honest, with this one. And we're very grateful to have the benefit of your expertise into this topic. As I said at the start, SEC Newgate has recorded this webinar, so it'll be available on our website, secnewgate.co.uk, and on our social media feeds as well, if you want to revisit any of the discussion points that have been covered this afternoon. Again, if there's any points that you wish to pick up with our panellists, or if there's anything that SEC Newgate can help you with in terms of engagement with communities, politicians, or the media, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So it just remains for me to say thank you very, very much to all our fantastic panellists this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.